They're called lazy by people who've never seen their hustle. They're called fragile by people who've never carried their weight. They quit jobs that make them miserable and get called entitled. They talk openly about mental health and get called weak. Generation Z. Born between 1997 and 2012. The most analyzed, most mocked, and most radically misunderstood generation alive. But what if everything you think you know about them is just the surface? What if the psychology underneath is so much more complex and so much more interesting than any headline has ever captured? Here's the thing about Gen Z that most people miss completely. They're not a reaction to one event. They're a reaction to everything. The financial crisis, school shootings, a global pandemic, climate anxiety, political polarization, the collapse of every institution their parents told them to trust. All of that hit them during the most psychologically vulnerable window of their lives, childhood and adolescence, the years when your brain is literally deciding how to interpret the world. So no, they're not dramatic, they're calibrated. And understanding the difference changes everything. Point number 5 in this video is the one that reframes this entire generation. If you think Gen Z is just the anxious generation, that one will make you think again. Every generation has a relationship with safety. Boomers grew up during the Cold War, but in economic stability. Millennials had a mostly stable childhood until 9/11 shattered it overnight. But Gen Z? They never had a safety illusion to begin with. Think about what a Gen Z kid's childhood looked like. They watched the 2008 financial crisis destroy their parents' savings. Some of them lost their homes before they were 10. They grew up doing active shooter drills in elementary school. Not as a hypothetical, as a routine. Like a fire drill, except the threat was another human being. Psychologists describe this as ambient trauma, a constant, low-level awareness that the world is not safe, even when nothing bad is actively happening. It's different from acute trauma. You're not responding to a single event. You're marinating in a feeling. Every day, for years. And that rewires the brain. The amygdala, the part responsible for threat detection, becomes hyperactive. The nervous system stays slightly elevated. You're never fully relaxed, even when you logically know you're fine. This is why Gen Z seems hyper-vigilant. Why they overthink. Why they prepare for worst-case scenarios. It's not anxiety as a personality flaw. It's anxiety as an adaptation to the world they were given. If boomers valued loyalty and millennials valued optimism, Gen Z values one thing above almost everything else: authenticity. And there's a very specific psychological reason for that. Gen Z is the first generation that grew up watching millennials perform online. They saw the curated Instagram feeds, the perfectly staged brunches, the hustle culture that masked burnout, and they watched that entire performance collapse in real time. They saw influencers get exposed. They saw brands pretend to care about social causes while doing nothing behind the scenes. They saw politicians say one thing on camera and do the opposite in office. And all of that happened during their formative years, when the brain is building its model of who to trust. The result? A generation with the most finely tuned BS detector in human history. They don't just dislike inauthenticity, they can smell it instantly. A brand that tries too hard gets roasted. A person who performs vulnerability without substance gets called out. A leader who talks values but acts differently loses them forever. This isn't cynicism, it's pattern recognition. They've been watching the performance since birth. And they decided early. They'd rather be messy and real than polished and fake. Let's address the elephant in the room. Gen Z talks about mental health more than any generation before them, and depending on who you ask, that's either the bravest or the most self-indulgent thing a generation has ever done. Here's the psychology behind it. Every generation before Gen Z inherited the same unwritten rule. You don't talk about your pain. You push through. You cope privately. Vulnerability is weakness. Therapy is for people who are really broken. Gen Z looked at that rule and asked a simple question. How's that working out? They looked at the boomers who drank instead of processing their emotions, the Gen X parents who buried themselves in work to avoid confronting what they felt, the millennials who smiled on Instagram while falling apart behind the screen. And they decided, we're not doing that. Now, is there a shadow side to this? Absolutely. The overcorrection is real. Some researchers, like Jonathan Haidt, argue that the constant labeling of emotions and the normalization of therapeutic language can actually amplify distress rather than reduce it. When everything becomes a diagnosis, everyday sadness can start to feel like clinical depression. But here's the part most critics miss. Gen Z didn't create the mental health crisis. They inherited it. They're just the first generation honest enough to talk about it publicly. And whether the approach is perfect or not, the conversation they started is one that was long overdue. Remember the social contract we talked about in the Boomer video? Work hard, stay loyal, and the system takes care of you? Gen Z entered the world at the exact moment that contract was shredding. They watched their millennial older siblings do everything right, get the degree, land the internship, climb the ladder, and still end up drowning in student debt, priced out of housing, and stuck in jobs that paid less in real terms than the same jobs paid 30 years ago. And Gen Z did the math. Not emotionally, literally. This is the most financially literate young generation in recorded history. They track inflation. They understand compound interest. They know what a 401k is before they're old enough to have one. And they ran the numbers and realized the traditional path doesn't add up anymore. That's why they job hop. That's why they demand remote work. That's why they side hustle, freelance, build brands at 18, and refuse to give 40 years to a company that could lay them off in a Tuesday email. Older generations call this entitlement. But from a psychological standpoint, it's the opposite. It's calculated self-preservation. They're not lazy, they're strategic. And they're playing a completely different game than the one they were told to play. And now, the one I told you would reframe everything. The standard narrative about Gen Z is that they're the anxious generation, the fragile generation, the doom-scrolling, chronically online, emotionally overwhelmed generation. And sure, there's data to support parts of that. But here's what that narrative completely ignores. Gen Z is the first generation in modern history building a sense of meaning entirely from scratch. Boomers inherited meaning from institutions, the church, the company, the nation. Gen X found meaning in independence and self-reliance. Millennials chased meaning through achievement and experience. But Gen Z, every traditional source of meaning had already been questioned, debunked, or discredited by the time they showed up. Religion was declining. National pride was complicated. Career loyalty was dead. Even the American dream had an asterisk next to it. So what did they do? They started building meaning from the ground up. Through community, not inherited community, but chosen community. Through identity, not assigned identity, but self-defined identity. Through causes that feel personally urgent, climate, equity, mental health, digital rights. They're not nihilists. They're architects. They're constructing a framework for meaning in a world where every old framework collapsed. And the fact that they're doing it while also being the most anxious, most surveilled, and most economically disadvantaged young generation in decades. That's not fragility. That's resilience wearing a different outfit. So here's the truth about Gen Z. They're not the broken generation. They're the recalibrated generation. Every trait that gets mocked, the sensitivity, the boundary setting, the refusal to play by old rules, is a direct psychological response to the world they were handed. You don't have to agree with everything they do. But if you want to understand them, you have to stop looking at the behavior and start looking at what caused it. Because once you do, the most confusing generation suddenly becomes the most logical one. Which point hit you the hardest? Whether you're Gen Z yourself or you're watching from the outside, drop it in the comments. And if you haven't seen the rest of the series, we've already covered baby boomers and Gen Alpha. Links are in the description. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. See you in the next one.